The shocking return. The Langston mansion always stood like a fortress of wealth, white stone walls gleaming in the sunlight, tall glass windows reflecting the endless stretch of the gardens, fountains whispering in the silence. Inside, every detail spoke of money, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, golden frames with old family portraits, and chandeliers that caught even the faintest ray of sun. But that summer afternoon, the silence was broken. Gregory Langston, billionaire industrialist, stepped out of his black car and strode across the driveway with the impatience of a man used to the world waiting for him. He had returned earlier than anyone expected. His assistant didn't know. His household staff didn't know. Even his driver looked startled when Gregory told him to leave the luggage behind. He wanted to go in alone. The flight from Tokyo had been long, the meetings endless, but none of that mattered. Gregory wanted to surprise his 6-year-old daughter, Isabel. She was the only softness in his life, the only reminder that he was still human beneath the armor of wealth and power. He imagined her running toward him, small arms wrapping around his legs, her golden hair bouncing in the sunlight. He allowed himself a rare smile. But the smile froze the moment he opened the tall glass door leading to the patio. At first he heard it before he saw it, the frantic splashing of water, a child's cough, the sharp gasp of someone struggling. His heart thudded. He dropped his leather briefcase on the tiles with a dull thud and ran toward the sound. The pool stretched wide and turquoise, shimmering beneath the high sun, but what Gregory saw turned his blood cold. His daughter Isabel was sitting at the pool's edge, soaked to the bone, trembling violently. Beside her, half collapsed, was Maya Williams, the maid he had hired just 6 months ago. Maya's clothes clung to him, to her skin, her dark curls dripping, her lips tinged faintly blue. Her chest heaved as she coughed up water, gasping for air. "What the hell are you doing?" Gregory's voice cracked the air like a whip, sharp and furious. He dropped to his knees beside Isabel, pulling her into his arms, eyes scanning her fragile body for bruises or cuts. "Sweetheart, are you all right? Are you hurt? Talk to me." His voice shook in a way it rarely did in business boardrooms. Isabel coughed, shivering, her small hands clutching his shirt. "I'm okay, Daddy. I fell. Miss Maya, she jumped in. She saved me." But Gregory didn't seem to hear the last part. Or maybe he refused to. His eyes darted back to Maya, who tried to sit up, her voice hoarse. "She slipped near the deep end. There was no time to call for help. I had to." "Don't talk," Gregory snapped, his tone like ice. Maya's eyes flickered with pain, not just physical pain, but something deeper. She pressed her lips together, swallowing the words that wanted to escape. Gregory stood, cradling Isabel against him, and glared down at the maid. "If anything had happened to her, anything, I'd—" He stopped himself, rage choking the rest of the sentence. The other staff, drawn by the shouting, hurried out onto the patio. Gasps rippled through them as they took in the sight. The powerful Gregory Langston, drenched daughter in his arms, and Maya the maid on her knees coughing water from her lungs. "Call the doctor," Gregory barked at his butler, then turned back toward the mansion, carrying Isabel. Behind him, Maya stayed by the pool, soaked and shivering, but more hurt by his words than by the water that clung to her. Hours later, the mansion's private doctor assured Gregory that Isabel was safe, just shaken and chilled, no serious harm done. Wrapped in a blanket, she had finally fallen asleep in her bed. Gregory stood by the window of her room, staring out at the gardens, but his mind was a storm. He could not shake the image of Maya dragging Isabel out of the pool, but he refused to admit what Isabel had said, that Maya had saved her life. No, that girl should never have let Isabel near danger in the first place. He clenched his fists. He had trusted her to care for his daughter while he traveled the world. And what had happened? Isabel nearly drowned. His jaw tightened. In Gregory's world, mistakes had consequences. Maya's room. On the opposite end of the mansion, Maya sat on the edge of her small bed in the staff quarters. Her clothes were still damp, but she had no strength to change. She replayed everything again and again. Isabel slipping, the scream, the rush of water as she dived in without thinking. She should have felt proud for saving the child. Instead, she felt like a criminal. Gregory's glare, his words, They burned more than the chlorine in her lungs. She whispered to herself, "Why can't he see? I did what I had to." Tears welled, but she wiped them quickly. Maya had learned long ago that crying solved nothing. The next morning, at breakfast, the tension was thick. Gregory sat at the head of the long dining table, coffee steaming in his cup. Isabel sat beside him, pale but smiling faintly, and Maya stood at the far end, silent, waiting to serve. Isabel looked from her father to Maya. "Daddy," she said softly, "you didn't say thank you." Gregory froze. "Thank you? For Miss Maya. She saved me. You weren't here. She was." Isabel's small voice was steady, but her eyes filled with tears. The words hit Gregory harder than he expected. He set down his coffee cup, staring at his daughter, then at the maid. Maya kept her gaze lowered, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured juice into a glass. For a long moment, silence stretched across the table. Then Gregory said coldly, "Your safety is my responsibility, Isabel, not hers." Maya flinched as if the words were a blade. Isabel looked down, hurt by her father's refusal. And in that silence, something shifted, a fracture in the Langston mansion's perfect walls. A divide had opened, invisible but growing, and it would change everything that followed. The silent divide. The following days in the Langston mansion carried an unusual heaviness, a silence that was not ordinary but sharp, almost painful. Though the mansion was vast, filled with high ceilings and echoing halls, every step and every word felt magnified. Gregory Langston, known in the corporate world for his commanding presence and decisive authority, moved through his own home like a storm cloud refusing to pass. He spoke little, his sharp gaze constantly shifting between his daughter and the woman he silently blamed for what had happened at the pool. To the staff, his anger was not a surprise. Gregory Langston was a man who tolerated nothing less than perfection. In the boardroom, he was feared. In his company, his word was law. To fail him even in the smallest way could mean dismissal, disgrace, or worse. But this time, it was not a forgotten detail or a mishandled file that had provoked his wrath. It was something far more sacred, the safety of his only daughter. And to Gregory, there was no forgiveness for such a mistake, even if, deep down, he knew he had yet to hear the full truth. Maya Williams carried the weight of that silence like an anchor. Every morning she rose earlier than before, her steps soft on the staff hallway floor as though afraid her very existence might anger him further. She had come to the mansion 6 months earlier, grateful for the position despite its challenges. It was not easy being a maid in a house where perfection was demanded, but Maya had accepted the work because she needed it desperately, not for herself, but for her younger brother and grandmother back in the small neighborhood where she had grown up. Her wages kept their bills paid, her brother in school and food on their table. This job was more than work. It was survival. Now that survival felt fragile. Gregory had not fired her immediately after the incident, but his silence was almost worse. The look in his eyes, sharp and accusing, told her that one wrong step could cost her everything. Yet she did not regret what she had done. Isabel's small body slipping beneath the water, her frightened eyes wide and desperate. Maya could never have stood by and called for help while precious seconds ticked away. She had not thought, she had simply acted, as any human being with a beating heart would have done. And still, instead of gratitude, she received suspicion. Isabel, however, was different. The little girl clung to Maya more than ever in the days after the pool. She sought her comfort, her warmth, her songs at night. Gregory noticed it with growing discomfort. At breakfast, when he tried to engage his daughter in cheerful conversation, Isabel would glance toward Maya as though seeking her approval. At bedtime, she refused to sleep unless Maya was the one to read her a story. And in her innocent, stubborn way, she began repeating the truth that Gregory refused to acknowledge. "Daddy, Miss Maya saved me. You should say thank you." Each time those words were spoken, Gregory's face tightened, his jaw locking as though she had struck him. He could not bear the thought that his daughter's safety had been left in the hands of someone he considered unworthy of trust. To admit Maya's heroism meant to admit his own absence, his own failure to be there. And that was something Gregory Langston, billionaire, master of empires, conqueror of industries, could not allow himself to feel. But silence has a way of speaking louder than words. The more Gregory ignored Maya's presence, the more Isabel's heart leaned toward her, and the divide in the mansion deepened. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the gardens in hues of gold and crimson, Gregory sat in his study, a glass of scotch untouched on the desk before him. His laptop was open, emails from board members waiting for replies, numbers blinking on financial spreadsheets, but his mind was elsewhere. He could hear faint laughter drifting down the hall, the soft musical giggle of Isabel and the gentle answering voice of Maya. He closed his eyes, but the sound did not fade. Instead, it grew louder in his memory, reminding him of what Isabel had said. She saved me. Gregory pushed back from his desk abruptly and stood, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. He walked down the hall, each step heavier than the last, until he stopped at Isabel's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, and through the gap he saw them. Isabel was curled on her bed, hair loose around her shoulders, her cheeks still rosy from laughter. Maya sat beside her holding a book open, though the story seemed forgotten as they whispered about dreams and wishes. Isabel's hand rested on Maya's, and there was a peace in her small face that Gregory had not seen in weeks. For a moment, something twisted in his chest, a feeling he could not name. But pride, or perhaps fear, quickly smothered it. He pushed. The door opened, and the laughter ceased. "Isabel," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "It's time for sleep." The girl looked up, startled. "But Daddy, Miss Maya was just—" "I said it's time for sleep," Gregory repeated firmly. His eyes flicked to Maya, who rose immediately, bowing her head in silence. "Yes, sir," she murmured, stepping back toward the door. Isabel's eyes filled with tears. "Please, Daddy, let her stay a little longer." Gregory's tone hardened. "Enough, Isabel. You need rest." The child turned her face into the pillow, shoulders trembling, and Maya hesitated only a moment before leaving, her footsteps light but heavy with unspoken pain. Gregory stood by his daughter's bed, but the warmth he longed to give her did not come. She had already closed herself away from him, seeking comfort in silence rather than in his arms. The days turned into weeks, and the pattern repeated. The house was filled with wealth but empty of peace. The staff whispered quietly about the tension, careful never to let Gregory hear. Some admired Maya's patience, how she endured the coldness directed at her without complaint. Others feared she would not last much longer, that Gregory's anger would finally spill over and she would be dismissed. But something none of them expected soon came to light. One morning, Gregory received a call from Isabel's school. She had refused to join the class in painting because the teacher would not allow Maya to be present in the room. Instead, Isabel had cried, saying she wanted her nanny, her rescuer. Gregory's face flushed with humiliation as he listened. His daughter's attachment was becoming visible to others, and he could not allow gossip about his household to spread. That evening, he confronted Maya in the library. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows dancing across the walls as Gregory stood tall and cold before her. "You're overstepping your role," he said flatly. "My daughter relies on you too much. That ends now." Maya met his gaze with quiet dignity, though her heart pounded. "Sir, with respect, Isabel is a child. She nearly drowned. She's frightened, and she needs stability. I only give her comfort, that's all." Gregory's eyes narrowed. "What she needs is discipline, not dependence. And what I need is assurance that her life is not in danger because of your negligence." Her voice trembled, but she did not look away. "It wasn't negligence. I saved her life." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time, Maya had spoken directly against his judgment. Gregory's jaw clenched. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Be very careful, Maya. You may fool a child with your kindness, but I see the truth. Don't mistake my silence for forgiveness." Maya's throat tightened, but she stood her ground. "And don't mistake my silence for weakness," she whispered. The words stunned even her. For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked. Billionaire and Maid, power and defiance. two worlds colliding in a mansion where silence had ruled too long. Gregory turned sharply, ending the moment, but the battle lines had been drawn. That night, Isabel awoke from a nightmare calling for Maya. Gregory, hearing her cries, rushed in first. He tried to soothe her, but she pushed him away, sobbing, "I want Miss Maya." And in that painful instant, Gregory realized the truth he had tried to deny. No matter his money, no matter his authority, his daughter's heart was slipping further from his grasp and into the hands of the very woman he distrusted most. Storm in the mansion, the Langston mansion, with its marble halls and glittering chandeliers, had always been a fortress of reputation as much as of wealth. For years, Gregory Langston had cultivated an image of perfection, not only in business but also in his private life. He was a man who built empires and expected the world to admire his control. Yet now, within those tall walls of glass and stone, the Heartwarming were widening, spreading from one room to another, threatening to collapse the very image he had fought to protect. It began subtly, as storms often do, with whispers that floated in corners rather than thunder that cracked the sky. Gregory's friends and colleagues, men and women of similar standing, began to notice small things during their visits. Isabel clinging too tightly to the maid's hand, her laughter softening only when Maya was nearby, or her sudden silence when Gregory entered the room. At dinners, when the household staff moved quietly around the table, guests would exchange curious glances as the child ignored the expensive toys or elaborate desserts offered to her, instead waiting for Maya to appear, her face lighting up only then. These moments, harmless on the surface, became the fuel of gossip. Among Gregory's elite circle, nothing was more dangerous than the suggestion of weakness or loss of control. They whispered about it over champagne, in hushed conversations after charity galas. The Langston child is closer to the maid than her father. Gregory must be slipping. His house is not as perfect as he claims. Gregory heard fragments of these murmurs, carried back to him through the invisible channels of high society where every reputation was constantly weighed, judged, and compared. And each time he heard them, his pride tightened like a fist around his chest. To him, it was not just about Maya anymore. It was about power, about image, about proving that no one, least of all a maid, could weaken his control of his own household. One Saturday evening, the storm broke into the open. Gregory had invited several business partners to the mansion, hoping to reinforce his image of command and elegance. The dinner table was set with the finest crystal, candles flickered against the polished silverware, and the air was heavy with the fragrance of roses from the gardens. Gregory, dressed in a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression coldly confident. He needed ties. He night to go well. But as the guests took their seats and laughter filled the air, Isabel wandered into the dining room, her little feet tapping softly against the floor. Gregory's stern expression softened for an instant. His daughter was, after all, the jewel of his life, the one person who could remind him of warmth. He reached out his hand to her. "Come, sweetheart, say hello to our guests." But Isabel did not move toward him. Her blue eyes swept the room, and then she said in a clear, steady voice that pierced through the polite conversation, "Where is Miss Maya? I don't want to sit here without her." The words fell like a stone into still water. A ripple of silence spread across the table. Forks paused mid-air, and eyes turned to Gregory, waiting to see how he would handle the moment. His face flushed, though whether with anger or shame even he could not tell. He forced a smile, a brittle thing that cracked at the edges. "Maya is working, Isabel. You don't need her right now. Come, sit beside me." But the child shook her head, her small arms crossing stubbornly over her chest. "No, if Miss Maya can't sit here, then I don't want to sit either." There was a nervous chuckle from one of the guests, an attempt to break the tension, but the damage was done. Gregory's jaw locked as he excused himself briefly, standing and taking his daughter firmly by the hand. He led her out of the room, his steps sharp against the marble. Behind him, the guests exchanged knowing glances. In the hallway, he crouched down to Isabel's level, his voice low and tight. "You will not embarrass me like that again. Do you understand?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she whispered with the defiance only a child's love can give. "But she saved me, Daddy. You didn't." Gregory's breath caught, the words slicing deeper than he expected. He released her hand and stood, turning away before she said. He could see the storm in his eyes. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the mansion lay quiet again, Gregory found himself in his study, pacing the floor as though the walls were closing in. He poured himself another drink, though the glass from earlier remained untouched on his desk. He could not shake the sound of his daughter's voice, the truth buried in her simple words. He wanted to blame Maya, to believe she had manipulated Isabel into this unnatural closeness. But when he looked into his daughter's eyes, he saw no manipulation, only gratitude and love. Yet instead of easing his heart, it hardened it further. For Gregory, admitting Maya's worth meant admitting his own absence, and that was something his pride could not bear. Meanwhile, in her small room, Maya sat on the bed with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had heard the raised voices, felt the tension in the air, and she knew she was the cause. It did not matter that she had never sought Isabel's affection. It had come naturally, like sunlight finding a flower. But in Gregory's eyes, her presence was a threat. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for herself but for Isabel, that the child would not be caught in a storm too big for her small heart to carry. Yet storms do not pause for prayers. The following week, Gregory made his stance clear. He ordered that Maya was no longer to read to Isabel at night. The girl was to be cared for only by the governess during study hours, and Maya's duties were restricted to cleaning and serving, nothing more. To the staff, it was obvious. Gregory was trying to sever the bond between the maid and his daughter. But Isabel was not a child who could be commanded so easily. On the very first night of the new rule, she refused to sleep, screaming and crying until her voice was hoarse. The governess tried to comfort her, but Isabel pushed her away. "I want Miss Maya. I only want Miss Maya," she wailed, her small fists pounding the pillow. Gregory, standing outside the door, listened to his daughter's cries with a face carved in stone. His pride demanded silence, obedience. But his heart twisted in agony, torn between his authority as a father and the simple truth of his daughter's need. He turned away before his resolve could weaken, leaving the child to cry herself into exhausted sleep. The mansion grew heavier with each passing day, the silence between Gregory and Maya thickening like a wall of ice. Yet beneath the surface, unseen by Gregory but felt by everyone else, another truth was forming. The more he tried to separate them, the more unbreakable the bond between Isabel and Maya became. And soon, that bond would be tested in a way none of them expected, when the storm inside the mansion spilled out into the world beyond its walls. The breaking point, the Langston mansion had grown quieter over the weeks, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that builds before a storm unleashes its fury. The staff spoke less, their footsteps lighter, their movements careful. Even the air felt heavier, as though the very walls of marble and glass carried the weight of the unspoken conflict between Gregory and Maya. Gregory had hardened his rules, determined to create distance between his daughter and the maid, but Isabel resisted with a stubbornness that mirrored his own. Every rule became a battle, every command became a spark, and like any fire, sparks eventually ignite something much larger. The breaking point came one late autumn morning, when golden leaves covered the driveway and the air carried the crisp edge of the changing season. Gregory was away in the city, attending a board meeting that promised to secure a new international deal. For him, business was an empire of control. Numbers and contracts bowed to his will, and that victories could be calculated. But in the quiet suburbs where Isabel's prestigious school stood, life was not so easily controlled. The breaking point came one late autumn morning when golden leaves covered the driveway and the air carried the crisp edge of the changing season. Gregory was away in the city attending a board meeting that promised to secure a new international deal. For him, business was an empire of control. Numbers and contracts bowed to his will and victories could be calculated. But in the quiet suburbs where Isabel's prestigious school stood, life was not so easily controlled. It began as a normal day for Isabel. She wore her navy uniform with its crisp white collar, her blonde hair tied neatly in ribbons. Maya had helped her prepare that morning, kneeling down to fasten her shoes and whispering encouragement, the kind of gentle support that steadied Isabel's heart before she faced the long day away from home. At school, however, Isabel's world was not as kind as Maya's words. The other children of senators, bankers, and heirs to fortunes, had begun to whisper about her. Children repeat what they hear from their parents, and lately their parents had been whispering too loudly about the Langston household. Isabel, young as she was, could not escape the cruel curiosity of her classmates. During recess, as she tried to draw quietly at a table by herself, two older girls approached. Their shoes clicked against the pavement, their voices low but sharp with mischief. "Your nanny is a maid, isn't she?" one girl sneered, her nose wrinkling. "She's not my nanny," Isabel replied softly, her cheeks flushing. "She's Miss Maya. She's my friend." The second girl laughed, tossing her hair. "My mom says your dad lets the maid pretend to be family. That's pathetic. No wonder he doesn't come to school events. He's too embarrassed." The words cut deeper than Isabel expected. Her father's absence at school recitals, the empty seat at parent-teacher meetings, those wounds were already there, and now these girls pressed against them with merciless fingers. Isabel tried to hold back tears, but they came anyway, spilling hot down her cheeks. The laughter of the girls grew louder, and soon other children noticed. Some joined in, repeating the word "maid" like it was an insult, chanting it with cruel rhythm. Isabel's small hands clenched around her drawing, crumpling the paper until it tore. Her chest heaved as panic bubbled up, the voices surrounding her until she felt she might drown again, this time not in water, but in shame. It was then that the governess assigned by Gregory to watch Isabel during the day hurried forward. She tried to shoo the children away, but her voice was weak, ineffective. Isabel continued to sob, her small shoulders trembling. And then, as though summoned by the cries of the child, Maya appeared at the school gates. She had come on her own, carrying a small lunch Isabel had forgotten in her rush that morning. She had not been asked to come. In fact, she had been told firmly by Gregory to keep her duties confined to the mansion. But something in her heart had urged her, a quiet instinct she could not ignore. The moment Isabel saw Maya, she ran, her tiny legs carrying her with desperate speed. She flung herself into Maya's arms, burying her face against the maid's shoulder. Maya held her close, whispering softly, her hands stroking the child's hair. The cruel laughter ceased, replaced by an uneasy hush. Even the children who had mocked her fell silent, sensing a truth too big for their young minds to fully understand, that in that moment Maya was not a servant, but a savior. A teacher eventually intervened, dispersing the crowd, but the scene had been witnessed by too many. By the end of the day, word of Isabel's breakdown and the maid's intervention had reached the ears of other parents. Some clucked their tongues in disapproval, others whispered with pity, and before long the story traveled through the corridors of privilege until it reached Gregory Langston himself. Maya had left her studies behind, returning home to take whatever work she could find. She had cleaned houses, waited tables, and finally found her way into the Langston mansion, steady pay, though far beneath her capabilities. Gregory read the words again and again, unsettled. She was not a maid because she lacked ambition or intelligence. She was a maid because life had forced her to sacrifice everything for her family. He closed the folder, but the truth weighed heavily on his chest. That evening, Gregory called Maya into his study. She entered quietly, her hands clasped before her, her posture respectful but not submissive. She had grown used to his coldness, but something in his face tonight was different. Less anger, more conflict. "I looked into your past," he said, his voice even but edged with curiosity. "You had opportunities, scholarships, a future in academia. Why did you give all that up?" Maya met his gaze, her dark eyes unwavering. "Because my family needed me. My mother was sick. My brother was just a child. Dreams don't mean much when the people you love can't eat. I did what I had to do." Her voice was calm, but beneath it was a quiet strength, the kind born not of privilege but of hardship. Gregory leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You expect me to believe that you gave up everything for them?" "I don't expect you to believe anything, sir," she replied, "but it's the truth. You see sacrifice as weakness. I see it as love." The word struck him harder than he cared to admit. For years, Gregory had built his empire on sacrifice of another kind, the sacrifice of time, of relationships, of his own presence in his daughter's life. But his sacrifices had been for power, not for people. Maya's sacrifices had been for love. The comparison unsettled him deeply. For a long moment neither spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Finally, Gregory said, "Isabel, she clings to you more than to me. Why?" Maya hesitated, then answered with honesty. "Because I listen to her. Because I'm there when she cries. Because she knows I won't leave." The silence after those words was heavier than stone. Gregory dismissed her with a nod, but her voice lingered in his ears long after she left. That night, Isabel wandered into her father's study. She carried her doll, the one Maya had sewn, and climbed onto his lap without waiting for permission. Gregory, startled, set aside his papers. "Daddy," she whispered, "do you love Miss Maya?" Gregory stiffened. "She works for us, Isabel, that's all." But Isabel shook her head, her small hands gripping his sleeve. "No, she's family, you just don't see it yet." The words pierced through the armor of his pride, leaving him shaken. For the first time, Gregory felt the ground beneath his certainty begin to crack. He had built his world on wealth, power, and control. Yet here, in the innocence of his daughter's voice, was a truth he could no longer ignore. Maya Williams was not just a maid. She was the heart his daughter clung to, the voice that soothed her, the strength that held her when he could not. And perhaps, if he dared to admit it, she was the mirror reflecting everything he had failed to be. The Billionaire's fall, the Langston name had long been spoken with a mixture of respect and fear in financial circles. Gregory Langston was the man who could walk into a boardroom and silence it with a single glance. He was the man whose signature could shift markets and whose handshake could seal deals worth billions. To the public, he was untouchable, an empire dressed in tailored suits and carried on unyielding ambition. But even the strongest empires, when built on brittle foundations, can begin to crack. And when they crack, the fall is never gentle. It began with whispers, just as storms often do. A small article in a financial journal questioning the stability of one of Gregory's overseas ventures. A sudden dip in stock values after rumors of mismanagement in a subsidiary. To most, these were minor tremors, the kind of background noise that wealthy men like Gregory brushed aside with a confident smile. But to Gregory, they felt like warning shots, and he knew well enough that warning shots, if ignored, always lead to war. His days grew longer, his nights restless. He spent hours locked in his study, pacing the floor with phone pressed to his ear, barking instructions at executives, demanding results, dismissing explanations. Yet the harder he pushed, the more resistance he met. Shareholders grew uneasy, partners began asking questions, and competitors, sensing weakness, circled like wolves at the edge of firelight. Inside the mansion, his presence became more ghost than guardian. Isabel saw less of him than ever. Meals were eaten in silence or in his absence. Even when he sat across from her at the long dining table, his mind was miles away, his eyes fixed on invisible battles only he could see. To her, his face seemed harder now, older somehow, as though the weight of the empire he carried had finally begun to bend his shoulders. Maya noticed it too. She saw it in the dark circles beneath his eyes, the clenched jaw, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. But she said nothing. Gregory had built walls of pride too thick for comfort or advice to penetrate. All she could do was continue her quiet care of Isabel, shielding the girl from the storm that raged both inside and outside the mansion. The breaking point came on a cold November morning when the headlines screamed the fall of one of Gregory's flagship companies, an internal scandal, an embezzlement uncovered by auditors the news with brutal force. Though Gregory himself was not directly involved, the stain was enough to send shockwaves through his empire. Stock values plummeted, investors panicked, and journalists, always hungry for the downfall of the mighty, flooded the airwaves with questions about whether Gregory Langston had finally overreached. That morning, Gregory sat in his study with the newspaper spread before him, his usually steady hands gripping the edges until they shook. For years he had been the one to expose weakness in others, the predator who capitalized on the mistakes of rivals. Now he was the headline, and the taste of it was bitter beyond words. Isabel wandered into the study carrying the doll Maya had sewn. She climbed onto the couch and looked at her father quietly. "Daddy, are you sick?" she asked softly. Gregory's head snapped up, startled. "What do you mean? You look different, like you're hurting." Her small eyes searched his face with innocent worry. For a moment, Gregory wanted to deny it, to summon the usual mask of strength, but the mask slipped, just a little. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I'm not sick, sweetheart. Just tired." Isabel tilted her head. "Miss Maya says when people are tired in their hearts, it's worse than being tired in their bodies. Is that true?" The word struck him harder than he expected. He looked at his daughter, then away, unable to answer. As the days passed, the empire continued to tremble. Gregory's advisors urged him to step back, to restructure, to show humility before the market devoured him whole. But humility was a foreign language to him. He fought back with sharper commands, harsher decisions, until even his most loyal executives began to waver. In the mansion, the staff whispered quietly that their master was unraveling, though none dared speak the words aloud. One night, after another day of losses, Gregory returned home later than usual. The mansion was quiet, the lights dimmed, the echo of his footsteps lonely in the vast halls. As he passed Isabel's room, he paused. The door was open just slightly, and he could hear her voice, soft, worried. "Miss Maya, is Daddy going to be okay?" Maya's reply was gentle, calm. "He's strong, Isabel, stronger than you know, but even strong people need help sometimes." There was a pause, then Isabel whispered, "But who helps him? He doesn't let anyone in." Gregory's breath caught in his chest. He had heard his daughter speak many things, but never had her words cut so deeply. He turned away before they could hear him, retreating to his study where the fire burned low. He sat alone for hours, the truth gnawing at him. He was a man surrounded by wealth and power, yet utterly alone. The fall became undeniable when a major investor pulled out, taking millions with him. Gregory faced the press in a conference hall packed with flashing cameras, his every word dissected by analysts. He spoke with authority, his voice steady, but the questions came like blows. Did he still control his empire? Could he be trusted? Was the Langston dynasty nearing its end? By the time he returned to the mansion that evening, exhaustion clung to him like chains. For the first time in years, he loosened his tie not in triumph but in defeat. He walked into the kitchen and found Maya there preparing tea for Isabel. She looked up, surprised to see him, but said nothing. For a long moment, Gregory simply stood there staring at her. Something in her calm presence unsettled him. She was not rattled by scandal, not shaken by headlines. She moved with the quiet strength of someone who had already survived far worse. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. Maya blinked. "Regret what, sir?" "Everything you gave up. Your studies, your future, to live like this." He gestured vaguely at her apron, her hands, her modest life compared to the empire he had built. Maya's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "I don't regret loving my family enough to put them first. Struggle doesn't make me smaller, Mr. Langston. It makes me stronger." Gregory felt something in his chest shift, though he did not admit it aloud. He left the kitchen without another word, but her words followed him long into the night. For Gregory Langston, the fall was no longer just financial. It was personal, emotional, the crumbling of an identity he had built stone by stone. And yet, even as the walls of his empire threatened to collapse, he began to see a strange truth rising in the rubble. Sometimes strength is not in power or wealth, but in the quiet resilience of those the world overlooks. And though he could not yet confess it, he knew the day was coming when his empire would not be saved by contracts or shareholders, but perhaps by the very Maid he had once despised. Redemption at the pool. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came a strange quiet after the storm of Gregory Langston's fall. His empire had survived, though scarred. Some companies were sold off, some ventures abandoned, But the man who had once been known for his iron control had been forced to bend. For the first time in his life, Gregory had stood before shareholders and admitted mistakes. For the first time, he had faced a world that no longer bowed instantly to his name. And though humiliation had been bitter, something unexpected had also come with it, a sense of clarity he had never known before. Gregory found himself spending more time at the mansion, not in his study buried under numbers, but with Isabel. He discovered the quiet joys of walking her to the gardens, of listening as she showed him her drawing, of simply sitting in her presence without the weight of a phone in his hand. She was shy at first, hesitant, as though unsure if this version of her father was real. But slowly her smile began to return, her small hand seeking his more often. It was not easy to reclaim her trust, but Gregory was learning that love was not won with force, it was earned with patience. And always, silently but steadily, there was Maya. She continued her duties without complaint, guiding Isabel with the same gentle strength she always had. Yet there was a new air about her now, a quiet acknowledgement in Gregory's eyes each time they crossed paths. He no longer looked through her as though she were invisible. He no longer barked commands or dismissed her words. Instead, there was something unspoken between them, a recognition of truth. One warm afternoon, as the sunlight shimmered across the mansion's gardens, Gregory stood by the tall windows of his study and looked out at the pool. The water sparkled, a perfect mirror of the sky, but in his mind it was not serene, it was haunted. He remembered the day he had returned home to find Isabel trembling on its edge and Maya gasping for air. He remembered the anger, the pride, the blindness that had led him to scorn the very woman who had saved his daughter's life. And he knew then, with a clarity sharper than any financial report, that it was time to return to the place where it had all begun. He called for Isabel and asked Maya to join them. The maid hesitated, uncertain, but Isabel's eager tug on her hand convinced her to follow. Together the three of them walked out to the poolside. The sun was high, casting golden reflections across the water, just as it had months before. The memory of that day hung heavy in the air, yet this time the silence was not filled with anger. It was filled with expectation. Gregory stood still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the turquoise water. Then slowly he turned to Maya. For once there was no steel in it, his eyes, no prideful shield. His voice, when he spoke, was lower, steadier, almost uncertain. "I've been a fool," he said. "That day you saved my daughter. You saved the only thing in this world I cannot replace, and I looked at you with suspicion instead of gratitude." Maya's lips parted in surprise, but she said nothing. Isabel's eyes widened, her small hand tightening around Maya's fingers, as though urging her to listen. Gregory drew a deep breath and continued. "I thought being her father meant control, that providing her with wealth and safety was enough. But I was wrong. A father isn't just the man who builds walls to protect his child. He's the man who holds her when she cries, who listens when she whispers, who shows her she is never alone. And in all the ways I failed, you stepped in. You gave her what I didn't." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of unspoken years pressing against him. "For that, Maya, I owe you more than I can ever repay. Thank you." The words, simple as they were, carried the weight of a lifetime. For the first time since she had entered the mansion, Maya felt seen, not as staff, not as a servant, but as a human being whose courage and love had mattered. Her eyes shimmered, though she quickly looked away to hide the emotion that threatened to spill. Isabel, however, made no attempt to hide her joy. She clapped her hands, beaming. "See, Miss Maya? I told you Daddy would thank you one day." Gregory smiled faintly, a smile different from the ones he used in boardrooms or at galas. This one was softer, real. He crouched down, pulling Isabel close, and then looked up at Maya once more. "I can't change the past," he said quietly, "but I can change what comes next. If you're willing, I'd like you to stay, not just as staff, but as part of this family." Maya's breath caught. She had expected dismissal 100 times, but never this. Yes. He searched his face, looking for pride, for condescension, for the sharpness that had once defined him, but she found none, only sincerity. "I'll stay," she said softly, because Isabel needs me, and because maybe you do too. Gregory nodded, humbled, and for the first time in years, he felt something loosen in his chest. From that day forward, the mansion was no longer a fortress of silence. Laughter returned to its halls, not only Isabel's giggles but the deeper sound of voices sharing, listening, forgiving. Gregory began to learn the rhythms of fatherhood, not as a commander, but as a presence. He stumbled at times, but Maya's quiet steadiness guided him, not through commands but through example. Months later, on another bright summer afternoon, the three of them returned again to the pool. This time, Isabel splashed happily in the shallow end, her laughter ringing out like music. Gregory sat on the patio watching her while Maya knelt nearby, ready to catch her if she slipped. And as Gregory watched, he realized something profound. Wealth could build mansions, but it could not build love. Power could command respect, but it could not command trust. What truly mattered were the moments like this, simple, fragile, and yet more valuable than any fortune. The billionaire who once measured life in profits and losses now measured it in the smile of his daughter, the dignity of the woman who had saved her, and the truth that redemption is not found in holding on to pride, but in letting it go. The storm had passed. The mansion still stood. And for the first time in his life, Gregory Langston understood that true wealth was not in his empire, but in the family he had nearly lost, and finally learned to cherish.